This is Chapter 19, Section 2, the Home Front. After the U.S. enters the war, finally, the whole country begins to mobilize for the war effort. And there is quite a lot to be done. If you think about it, what do we need when we go to war? Yes, we need soldiers, but what do the soldiers need? Yes, they need guns, they need ammunition, they need uniforms, they need food, they need equipment. And so the whole country is going to be put on alert, if you will, to organize and to make sure that the troops that we send over there have everything they need. If you notice here on this page, we have a picture of a propaganda poster that it says, "They are giving all, will you send them wheat?" This is by the U.S. Food Administration. U.S. Food Administration's job was to get people to voluntarily decrease their consumption so that there would be more food available to send to the soldiers. Things like wheat and butter and meat are going to be voluntarily rationed. This is not like World War II, when the country is basically forced to ration these things. Let's take a look and see what else happens on the home front during World War I. You will need to get out a piece of paper and you will need to answer some of the questions as we walk through this PowerPoint. First, you'll need to complete this chart. It says, complete the chart, then pick one agency and create a drawing to represent their efforts. So I've listed 4 of the agencies that were created during World War I to mobilize the country for the war effort. The War Industries Board is the first one. You are to figure out its purpose. So what was it designed to do? And then in the second box here, you are to give it a specific example of something people did or that they accomplished. For example, the Food Administration, one of the things they did was meatless Mondays. And so you could put that in for a specific example. As you follow through the other slides, you will find the answers. So if you'll just copy those down in the chart, then you will have these for your notes. In order to build up our military, the first thing we do is we ask for volunteers. And then Wilson realizes he needs to put in place what's called selective service, which is basically the draft. Another term for it is conscription. All males between the ages of 21 and 30 are required to register. They then basically hold a lottery and pick out of the lottery bucket, if you will, the people who will be going over. They did it by birthday. If you had your birthday on that day that they pick out, then you were drafted. They did this on a local level, though. So if you were important to the war effort, let's say your job, you were in charge of a factory where they were making helmets, then if you were called, you could actually say, hey, I've got this real important job, and they would let you out. So you did not have to go. But for the most part, most people who were called up did go. We are actually going to draft African Americans in this war. About 400,000 are drafted and 42,000 are actually sent overseas for duty. They are going to be in segregated units, meaning the unit itself is going to be made up of all African Americans, and then they're going to have white officers. We do see in this war, though, there are a few African Americans who reach the rank of various officers. And overall, they're going to distinguish themselves in the service that they do carry out. Many of them, unfortunately, though, are going to be left with duties such as building and cleanup and cooking duties and things like that. Women, for the first time, officially get to join the armed services. Again, most of them are going to be all of them are going to be non-combat positions. They're going to do things like clerical, paperwork, typing, that sort of thing, and nursing. Only Army nurses, though, are going to be sent overseas. The other branches, I believe the Navy does have some nurses, but they are not going to be sent overseas. So the majority of the women are actually going to stay here in the United States, but they are going to join in the war effort. We have here a couple of examples of U.S. war propaganda. At the top you see happy, smiling officers. I seriously doubt they were happy and smiling after they saw service, but these are the images that were out there so that are to encourage people to join. Down on the bottom we see Uncle Sam says, "Don't wait for the draft, but volunteer." So trying to encourage young men to join in and do the patriotic thing. On the other side we have an ad actually for the American Red Cross. They play a huge part in this war, and they were always looking for drivers and mechanics and people skilled in the medical field. If you recall, when was the Red Cross founded? During which war? That's exactly right. It's the Civil War. Good job. Here's where you're going to need your chart. Government is going to begin to mobilize industries for the war effort. So certain products are not going to be made during the war, and other products will be made instead. Things like uniforms and obviously munitions and guns and bullets and helmets and things like that. The War Industries Board is going to be responsible for coordinating the production of all the war materials. A man named Bernard Baruch was responsible for this. It also kept track of the flow of materials. Only certain resources could be used, and so they didn't want people wasting resources on non-military items. Food Administration is another agency that is founded, and the main job of this is to increase the production of food and also to reduce consumption, because if you're not eating it, then it could go to the troops. Herbert Hoover, who will be a president in the future, is going to be in charge of this. One of the slogans of the time was called Hooverize. And if you Hooverize, then you were consuming less and helping the war effort. They encourage people to grow their own vegetables. So again, the vegetables at the stores and in the big fields could be sent over to the troops. The gardens, they called them victory gardens. And there's a nice little picture of a happy mom doing her part, growing her own vegetables. They did a couple other things such as heatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays, encouraging you to not eat meat, to not use heat. Can't imagine how fun that was, on certain days of the week, because all of that you didn't use could then be sent to the troops. It was considered very patriotic to do these things. Of course, you had people, neighbors, encouraging each other. And there, again, this was all voluntary, but imagine the pressure on, let's say, a German immigrant family to make sure they were doing everything they could to be patriotic. One of the other ones was the Fuel Administration. And they kept track of the amount of fuel, coal, oil, and oil that the government was using and that consumers were using. Wanted to make sure that, again, we were using it wisely and all the extra could go to the troops. One of the things that was instituted at this time in order to save fuel is daylight savings time. Because if the factories were not running when it was dark, then that would be a savings on the fuel. Think about today. Why haven't we done any of these measures for the Iraq War or for our war in Afghanistan? War is expensive. I'm sure maybe some of you have seen the total expenditures for our most recent wars. It's in the billions of dollars. Funding for this war comes in a couple different ways. First of all, the government had already passed the income tax, so they are taxing people's incomes. They've actually raised the percentage of that tax to increase the money coming in. They also begin to tax industries or businesses on the profits that they made. So it's kind of like taxing the income of the businesses. And last but not least was an effort to get people, everyday people like you and me, to buy bonds. And this is basically a loan to the government. I don't know if any of you have bonds, U.S. Treasury bonds, government bonds, but this is how they work. Let's say you want to buy a $50 savings bond. Well, today you would buy a $50 savings bond and you would pay $25 for it. Now, in a certain number of years, we'll say I think it's 7, you can take that piece of paper that is your bond and you can go to the bank and they will give you $50 for it, even though 7 years ago you only paid $25. So you, in doing so, give the government that $25. The government spends that money, uses it on whatever it needs, and then in 7 years they pay you back your $25 plus interest of $25. And so it's basically a loan to the government. The government made quite a lot of money this way. And again, it was part of your patriotic duty. As you can see here, we have several advertisements encouraging people to buy their Liberty bonds. One of the things is down at the bottom. If you once you bought one, you got this little pin to wear on your coat or your lapel. And so if you had it, then everybody knew that you were supporting the war. This war cost about $32 billion total. So again, it was quite a lot of money needed to be raised. I want you to think about modern day. Do we show our support for various causes by pinning anything to our lapels? Not only do we need to mobilize companies, but we also actually needed to mobilize the workforce. The National War Labor Board, their job was to make sure that the workers were happy, that people were not going on strike, that the workers were producing the goods that needed to be used for the war and for home. So they tried to make sure wages were fair and working conditions were safe. Women actually increase their numbers in jobs at this time, and I'm sure you can figure out why. Certainly all the men, not all, but a good portion of them are off fighting, and so women end up taking their places in the factories. This is not going to be permanent. Women are actually going to go back to home after the war. We're going to see that same pattern follow in World War II. African Americans are going to use this opportunity to move up north into the big cities, and I'm sure you can guess why. Again, there are jobs available, and the pay is better than what most southern African Americans have been making on the farms. And so they move in, it's called the Great Migration. They move up north to gain a better life. Now, in one way, this is good because they're getting better jobs and making more money, but it also causes quite a lot of tension, racial tension in the cities, because cities that were predominantly white are now going to be a mix of white and black, and we're going to see, unfortunately, at this time, a lot of racial violence. What do you call it? People kind of rioting in the streets, attacking various neighborhoods made up of African Americans and things like that. We're also going to see, as a group, Mexican Americans are going to gain a lot of jobs. At one point, the United States actually asked Mexicans to come across the border to take some of the farm jobs. because we need everybody we can get. And so we're going to see an influx of Mexicans who come across the border, and many of them are going to choose to stay after the war and become, American citizens. The areas that they lived get a little nickname, and it's called the barrios, which is just, I believe, a Spanish word for neighborhood. But this is also going to cause some tensions between the various ethnicities in the area that they settle in. The government is going to attempt to shape public opinion at this time. This is a big war effort, and so the government needs everybody on their side, and they're not going to allow for any dissension or people speaking out against the war. So a committee on public information is organized, and again, government agency. It's headed by a man named George Creel, and it's his job to really encourage everyone to do their part, to show them how to be patriotic by sponsoring the war effort and by backing the soldiers and doing their part at home. They do this in a variety of ways. Committee on Public Information creates lots of pamphlets that they send out to people. They sponsor these things called 4-minute talks. And if you had gone to a play or a musical performance at this time, perhaps before or after the performance, these patriots or 4-minute men would stand up in front and they would tell you, you need to go buy your Liberty bonds, you need to support the war effort. And they're supposed to just talk for 4 minutes, hence the name 4-Minute Men. Get it? Minutemen, going back to the Revolutionary War, the Minutemen ready to fight on a minute's notice. So it's kind of just rolling all that, the idea of America and what we're all about together. The other thing that you might find a little strange during this time is because the government wanted everybody to be on board, they are going to punish those people that are not. And so they passed some very strict laws that curb our free speech rights. One is the Espionage Act of 1917. It basically said that if you help the enemy in any way, if you are disloyal, if you try to disrupt the recruitment of soldiers, then you could be put in jail. The other one is called the Sedition Act, and this was passed in 1918. And if you expressed publicly that you were against the war, then again you could be arrested and put in jail. Now I want you to think about which right that both these laws really violate. Yes, our right of free speech. Can you imagine an act like this being passed today? How many of you, or maybe your parents, would be put in jail because they spoke out against their war in Afghanistan or the war in Iraq? Soon after the war is over, both of these acts do go away. Unfortunately, wartime often leads to a lot of fear and suspicion. Certainly on the home front, we experienced the same thing. Quite a lot of Germans had immigrated to the United States and lived here, and so we had quite a few Germans living amongst us. If you think about it, we're fighting the Germans over there, and yet we have Germans living amongst us. So there was quite a lot of fear as to maybe they were spies or that somehow they had something to do with, supporting Kaiser Wilhelm and his war. So they began to kind of have a campaign against anything German. You were not allowed to teach German. They changed the names of some very German-sounding things like sauerkraut. There's all sorts of political propaganda posters like this one that were against anything German. And here they have a American soldier bringing home a pig, which of course is bacon, but of course he's dressed up like a German soldier. The Boy Scouts of America got in on the act as well, and they encouraged their young men to watch your neighbor and see if he's doing things that are anti-American. And if he is, then you need to go and report him to the authorities, which is a little scary. There was a court case called Schneck versus United States. And basically this guy, Schneck, spoke out against conscription, against the draft, and against the war. And they arrested him under the Sedition Act. He took the case to the Supreme Court, saying that it was his free speech. And the Supreme Court said, no, during times of war, if your free speech presents a clear and present danger to the country, then we have the right to silence you. And so he lost. Again, it's a little scary when our rights are beginning to be taken away. We finally joined the war about 1917, but it takes us quite a while to get ourselves organized and over there. The term for going to Europe, we called it over there. There was a famous song at the time called Over There, and if you click that link, you should be able to hear it. But by war's end, we have sent almost 2 million men over there to fight. The commander of the American Expeditionary Force was John J. Pershing, and there he is. His nickname was Blackjack Pershing, because he had been in charge of, at one point in charge of a group of African-American soldiers. He's also the same guy that went after Pancho Villa down in Mexico and couldn't find him. The Americans, though, in order to get over there, we had to use our Navy. And so it's a good thing we had our Great White Fleet. A lot of our ships are going to carry not only cargo, but sailors and soldiers over there. We also borrowed a lot of ships from our allies to get our soldiers over there. If you're still with me, you've made it. You've finally finished. There was 11 slides, but the next one is exactly like this one. So congratulations. Make sure your chart is filled out and be ready to discuss it in the next day at class.